The screams pierced through the darkness of the night, a sound so raw and agonizing that it seemed to shake the very walls of the small house. Grace jolted awake, her skin on fire, the acrid smell of burning flesh filling her nostrils as boiling water seared through her nightgown and into her face and chest. Through her blurred vision and tears, she saw the silhouette standing over her bed, the empty pot still in hand. "Let's see if anyone wants you now," Patricia said coldly, her voice devoid of any emotion as she watched the girl writhe in pain. Grace's mouth opened to scream again, but only a strangled sob came out as she clutched her burning face, feeling the skin blister beneath her trembling fingers. The woman who had promised to be her mother turned and walked away, closing the door behind her as if nothing had happened. But this wasn't always Grace's reality. 15 years earlier, she had been a different child entirely, living a different life. Her father, David, would scoop her up in his strong arms every evening when he came home from work, spinning her around until her giggles filled their modest home. "There's my princess," he'd exclaim, kissing her forehead as her tiny hands reached for his face. He'd sit her on his lap and carefully part her thick, coily hair into sections, braiding it with surprising skill for a man, humming old songs her late mother used to sing. Grace barely remembered her biological mother, Esther, who had died when she was only 3, but she remembered the feeling of being loved, of being precious, of being enough. Those early years with just her and her father were painted in warm colors in her memory, a golden time before everything changed. When Patricia entered their lives, Grace was 7 years old and cautiously hopeful. Her father had been lonely for so long, and when he introduced the elegant woman with the bright smile, Grace wanted to believe in happy endings. "She's beautiful, isn't she, Grace?" David asked, his eyes shining with something Grace hadn't seen in years. Patricia knelt down to Grace's level, her perfume sweet and overwhelming, and took the little girl's hands in hers. "I've always wanted a daughter," Patricia said warmly, and Grace felt her father's hand on her shoulder, proud and relieved. For the first few months, Patricia seemed genuinely charmed by David's devotion to Grace. She'd watch with an amused smile as he braided Grace's hair before school, as he helped her with homework, as he saved the best pieces of meat for his daughter's plate. "You are such a wonderful father," Patricia would say, and David would beam. Grace dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a mother again. Everything changed the day Patricia announced she was pregnant. Grace was 9 years old, sitting at the dinner table when her stepmother placed her father's hand on her growing belly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We're going to have a baby, David. Can you believe it?" Patricia whispered, and David pulled her into an embrace so tight that Grace felt like she was watching from outside a window, suddenly on the wrong side of the glass. He was happy, genuinely happy, but there was something in Patricia's eyes when she glanced at Grace over his shoulder, a flash of something cold and calculating that made the little girl's stomach twist. Grace tried to smile, tried to be excited, but deep down she felt the first tremor of the earthquake that would shatter her world. When the twins, Rose and Lily, were born, 11 months later, David's attention split in ways Grace hadn't anticipated. But even then, she remained his favorite, his first princess, and that's when Patricia's mask began to slip. The twins were only 2 years old when David's company demanded he take night shifts to keep his position. "It's just temporary, sweetheart," he promised Grace, kissing her forehead as he prepared to leave for another long stretch at work. "Take care of your sisters for me, okay? You're such a good big sister." Grace nodded, not understanding that temporary would stretch into months, then years, and that those words would become her prison sentence. The moment David's car pulled away, Patricia's demeanor would shift like someone had flipped a switch. "Grace, get in here and clean up this mess," she'd bark, gesturing to toys that Rose and Lily had scattered across the living room. While her younger sisters sat on the couch watching cartoons, their legs swinging freely, Grace would be on her hands and knees, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, folding laundry that never seemed to end. At 10 years old, she learned to cook full meals, standing on a stool to reach the stove, her arms aching as she stirred pots of stew and jollof rice. But when dinner was served, Patricia would fill 3 plates, one for herself, one for Rose, one for Lily. Grace would watch them eat, her stomach growling, until Patricia would casually say, "There's bread in the kitchen, that's enough for you." Grace tried to tell her father. Of course she did. One evening when he came home early, she pulled him aside while Patricia was bathing the twins. "Daddy, I'm so tired. I have to do everything. And Mama Patricia doesn't let me eat dinner and..." But before she could finish, Patricia emerged from the bathroom, all warmth and smiles. "David, you're home early. What a wonderful surprise." She glided over to them, wrapping her arm around Grace's shoulders in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a warning. "Grace has been such an amazing help with her sisters. I was just telling her how proud we are of her, weren't we, Grace?" Her fingers dug into Grace's shoulder, and the girl felt the words die in her throat. David beamed at them both, exhausted from work, seeing only the picture of a happy blended family. "That's my girl. I knew I could count on you." After he went to shower, Patricia leaned down to Grace's ear, her voice barely a whisper. "If you ever try to turn him against me, I'll make sure you regret it. Do you understand?" Grace understood. She understood that she was alone, that her father's love had blind spots, and that her childhood was over. She was 11 years old. By the time Grace turned 16, she had transformed from a child into a young woman, and despite the exhaustion etched into her features and the cheap, ill-fitting clothes Patricia forced her to wear, her beauty was undeniable. She had inherited her late mother's high cheekbones, warm brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of untold stories, and a grace in her movements that no amount of scrubbing floors could diminish. Patricia noticed, and with that notice came a new opportunity for cruelty. "You'll work at the boutique," Patricia announced one morning, not as a question, but as a command. "Rose and Lily need new school supplies, and you'll earn your keep properly." The boutique, Patricia's fashion, was Patricia's pride and joy, a small but successful shop in the heart of town where she sold carefully curated clothing and accessories. Grace found herself there 6 days a week, arriving before opening to clean and arrange displays, staying after closing to restock and balance the register. She never saw a single naira for her labor. What Patricia hadn't anticipated was that Grace had an eye for fashion, an instinct for pairing colors and textures that seemed to come naturally. "Excuse me, miss," customers would say, bypassing Patricia entirely. "Which of these scarves would you recommend with this dress?" Grace would tilt her head, considering, then select a piece that would make the customer's eyes light up. "Oh, that's perfect. You have such wonderful taste," they'd exclaim, and Grace would feel a small flutter of pride, a reminder that she was more than just a servant, more than just invisible. But each compliment was a thorn in Patricia's side. She'd watch from behind the counter, her jaw tightening, her fingers drumming an irritated rhythm on the glass. One evening, after a particularly successful day where 3 customers had specifically requested Grace's help, Patricia grabbed her arm as they closed up. "Don't get too comfortable. You're here to work, not to show off. Remember your place." Grace pulled her arm away, something defiant flickering in her eyes for just a moment before she lowered her gaze. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered, but inside, a tiny seed of resistance had been planted. It was on a humid Saturday afternoon when Marcus Okafor walked into the boutique and Grace's life took an unexpected turn. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of wealth and taste, and he moved through the shop with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Grace was rearranging a display of handbags when she felt his gaze on her. "Excuse me," his voice was smooth, cultured. "Could you help me? I'm looking for a gift for my sister's birthday." Grace straightened, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear nervously. "Of course, sir. What does she like?" For the next 20 minutes, they talked, and Marcus found himself more captivated by the young woman's quiet intelligence and gentle manner than by any of the merchandise. As he prepared to leave, his purchase wrapped, he turned to her. "I didn't catch your name." "Grace," she said softly. "Grace, I'd like to see you again. May I have your number?" Before Grace could respond, Patricia materialized beside them, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Oh, Mr. Okafor, Grace is very young, very inexperienced. I'm not sure she'll be a good fit for someone of your stature." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his pleasant expression. "I think I can decide that for myself, ma'am." He handed Grace his phone. "Your number, if you're interested." Grace's hands trembled as she entered her digits, hope blooming in her chest for the first time in years. Marcus called the very next day, his voice warm with anticipation. "Grace, I'd like to take you to dinner. Are you free this Saturday evening?" Grace's heart soared, but even as she said yes, she could feel the weight of impossibility settling on her shoulders. Saturday came, and Patricia seemed to have eyes in the back of her head. "Grace, the bathroom needs scrubbing. Grace, Rose spilled juice all over the kitchen floor. Grace, I need you to hand wash all the curtains before your father gets home." The tasks were endless, deliberate, designed to consume every minute. By the time Grace frantically called Marcus, she was 2 hours late, breathless with apologies. "I'm so sorry. I had to help with some things at home. I'm on my way now." But she could hear the coolness creeping into his voice. "It's fine, Grace. Maybe another time." The pattern repeated itself like a cruel dance. Marcus would call, they'd set a date, and Patricia would orchestrate an avalanche of urgent chores. The second time, she was 3 hours late. The third time, she couldn't make it at all. "I'm starting to think you're not really interested," Marcus said during their fourth failed attempt, frustration evident in his tone. "Maybe you're just making excuses." "No, Marcus, please, I want to see you. It's just..." But how could she explain? How could she tell him that her stepmother was sabotaging her chance at happiness? It sounded insane, paranoid. "It's complicated," she finished weakly. "It always is," Marcus replied, and the line went dead. Grace threw herself into her work at the boutique, trying to bury her heartbreak in fabric and sales. She smiled at customers, offered her advice, and pretended she didn't notice Patricia's satisfied smirks. Months passed, and Grace convinced herself she'd imagined the connection with Marcus, that it had been a foolish dream all along. Then one evening, she came home to find the house transformed. Balloons in gold and white decorated every surface, tables laden with food, and people in their finest clothes milling about the living room. Grace stood in the doorway, confused, still in her work clothes. "What's going on?" she asked a neighbor. "Oh, you don't know? It's an engagement party for Lily." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She pushed through the crowd, her eyes searching frantically until she found them. Lily, radiant in a cream-colored dress, her hand extended to show off a glittering ring, and beside her, his arm around her waist, was Marcus. Grace's world tilted. Marcus saw her at the same moment, his expression flickering with surprise, then something like guilt, before Lily pulled him closer, laughing at something someone said. Patricia appeared at Grace's elbow, her breath hot against her ear. Surprised? Marcus came back to the boutique looking for someone worthy of his attention. I introduced him to Lily. They've been seeing each other for 2 months now. Isn't it wonderful? The smile Patricia gave her was pure poison, victorious and cruel. Grace didn't remember climbing the stairs to her tiny room, didn't remember closing the door or collapsing onto her narrow bed. The sounds of celebration filtered through the thin walls, music and laughter, the clinking of glasses as people toasted the happy couple. She pressed her face into her pillow and sobbed, great heaving cries that came from somewhere deep and broken inside her. This was her life, watching from the sidelines as others lived, as others were loved, as others got happy endings. Patricia had taken everything from her, her childhood, her father's attention, her dignity, and now even this one small possibility of escape, of love, had been snatched away and given to someone else. Grace cried until she had no tears left, until her body was empty and hollow. Through the walls, she could hear Lily's delighted laughter, bright and carefree, the sound of someone who had never known suffering, who had never been denied anything in her entire life. Grace closed her eyes and wished, desperately and uselessly, for her real mother, for someone who would protect her, for a different life than this endless nightmare. After Marcus's engagement to Lily, something shifted in Grace.
The light in her eyes dimmed, but a quiet resilience grew in its place. She was 18 now, and despite everything Patricia had done to break her, she remained beautiful. Men noticed. At the boutique, young professionals would linger, asking questions they didn't need answers to, finding excuses to return. On the street, heads turned. Grace didn't encourage them, didn't even really notice, but Patricia did. Each admiring glance, each potential suitor who approached Grace was another reminder to Patricia that no matter how hard she tried to diminish this girl, there was something in her that couldn't be extinguished. It drove Patricia to a fury she could barely contain. One evening, a young doctor came to the house specifically to ask David's permission to court Grace. Patricia watched through the window as David smiled, clearly pleased that his daughter was attracting such good prospects. That night, after David had given his tentative approval, pending Grace's own interest, Patricia lay awake in bed, her mind churning with dark thoughts. She couldn't let Grace have anything good. She wouldn't. The next few days, Patricia was unusually quiet, almost pleasant, which should have been Grace's first warning. Grace had learned to fear Patricia's anger, but she hadn't yet learned to fear her silence. It was a Tuesday night, and Grace had fallen into an exhausted sleep after another grueling day of housework and boutique duties. She was dreaming of her mother, of a time before all the pain, when the agony ripped her from sleep. The boiling water hit her face and chest, and Grace's screams tore through the house like sirens. She thrashed in her bed, her hands flying to her face as the skin blistered and burned, the pain so intense she thought she might die from it. Through her tears and the fog of agony, she saw Patricia standing over her, the empty pot still in her hands, her face cold and calculating. "Let's see if anyone wants you now," Patricia said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact, before she walked out of the room. Rose and Lily appeared in the doorway, their eyes wide with horror, but Patricia shooed them away. "Go back to bed, it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Grace's screams had awakened neighbors, and someone had already called David at work. David burst through the door 30 minutes later, his face white with panic. He found Grace in the bathroom, her stepsisters trying to help her apply cold water to her burns, her face and chest angry red and already blistering. "What happened? Grace, baby, what happened?" He was at her side in an instant, his hands hovering over her injuries, afraid to touch her and cause more pain. Grace tried to speak through her sobs, tried to tell him the truth, but Patricia was already there, tears streaming down her face in a performance worthy of an award. "Oh, David, it was terrible. There was an electrical fault in the kitchen, a spark from the kettle, the water just exploded. I tried to stop it, I tried to warn her, but it happened so fast." Patricia buried her face in her hand, her shoulders shaking. David looked between his wife and his daughter, and Grace saw the moment he made his choice. He wanted to believe Patricia. It was easier than believing the woman he'd married was capable of such evil. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said to Grace, kissing her forehead gently. "We'll get you to the hospital. It's going to be okay." But Grace knew nothing would ever be okay again. She caught Patricia's eye over her father's shoulder and saw the smallest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her stepmother's mouth. Grace had been marked, branded, her beauty stolen, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her father would never believe her. She was utterly, completely alone. The healing process was slow and painful, both physically and emotionally. Grace spent weeks with bandages covering half her face, the burns on her chest hidden beneath loose clothing. When the bandages finally came off, she stood before the mirror for a long time, studying the scarred landscape of her face. The burns had left their mark, raised, discolored patches across her right cheek and jawline, extending down her neck. She wasn't the same girl who had turned heads on the street. But as she traced the scars with her fingertips, Grace realized something unexpected. She didn't hate her reflection. The scars were proof she had survived. They were ugly, yes, but they were hers, a map of her endurance. "I'm still here," she whispered to her reflection, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the faint stirring of determination. Patricia had tried to destroy her, but Grace was still standing. Then came the morning that shattered what little remained of Grace's world. She woke to the sound of wailing, a keening cry that pierced through the walls and wrapped around her heart like ice. Grace stumbled out of bed and followed the sound to the living room, where she found Patricia collapsed on the floor, Rose and Lily clinging to her, all three of them sobbing. A neighbor stood awkwardly to the side, wringing his hand. "What's happening? What's wrong?" Grace asked, though somewhere deep inside she already knew. Patricia looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes, and for once there was no malice there, only genuine grief. "Your father, he had a heart attack at work. He's gone, Grace. He's gone." The words didn't make sense at first. They bounced off Grace's mind like stones skipping across water. Gone. Her father, the only person who had ever truly loved her. Grace's legs gave out and she sank to her knees, a sound emerging from her throat that she didn't recognize as her own. It was animalistic, raw, a howl of pure anguish. David was dead. The man who had braided her hair, who had called her his princess, who had loved her even if he'd been blind to her suffering. He was gone, and she would never get the chance to make him understand, to make him see the truth. The funeral was held the following week, and Grace moved through it like a ghost. She barely heard the pastor's words, barely noticed the mourners offering their condolences. She stood at her father's grave and felt the last tether to her old life snap. Rose and Lily cried theatrically, leaning on their mother, but Grace's tears were silent, falling like rain onto the red earth. After the burial, after the guests had left and the house had fallen quiet, Grace retreated to her room, exhausted beyond measure. She had nothing left, no hope, no future, no one to protect her. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring, but all she saw was darkness. Then, exactly 1 week after they'd buried David, Patricia knocked on Grace's door. When Grace opened it, Patricia stood there with an expression of cold satisfaction. "Pack your things," she said simply. "What?" Grace's voice was hoarse from crying. "You're leaving. This is my house now, and I want you out." Patricia crossed her arms, blocking the doorway. "But I have nowhere to go." Grace's heart began to race. "Not my problem. You've been a burden long enough. Your father left everything to me, and I'm done pretending to tolerate you." Patricia reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wad of bills. She counted them deliberately. "Here, 200 naira. That's more than generous." She thrust the money at Grace. Grace stared at the bills, then at Patricia's face, searching for any hint of humanity, any shred of mercy. There was none. "Please," Grace whispered. "I'll work harder. I won't eat much. I'll get out." Patricia's voice was final. Grace took the money with shaking hands, stuffed her few belongings into a worn bag, and walked out of the only home she'd ever known. She didn't look back. Grace used most of her 200 naira for a bus ticket to her grandmother's village, a place she'd only visited twice in her life, years ago, when her father was still courting Patricia. The journey took hours, the bus rattling along dusty roads, and Grace pressed her forehead against the grimy window, watching the city fade into countryside. She had no plan beyond reaching her grandmother, no idea if the old woman would even remember her. When she finally arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Grace walked the dirt path to her grandmother's small compound, her bag heavy on her shoulder, and knocked tentatively on the wooden door. The woman who answered was smaller than Grace remembered, her hair completely grey now, her face lined with age, but her eyes, sharp and knowing, widened with recognition. "Grace, is that really you, child?" Grandma Ruth pulled her inside before Grace could answer, and the moment the door closed behind them, Grace collapsed into her grandmother's arms and told her everything. Every cruelty, every injustice, every moment of suffering she'd endured. Ruth held her granddaughter as she wept, stroking her scarred face with gentle hands, and when Grace finally fell silent, the old woman's eyes were blazing with fury. "That woman is a devil," Ruth said quietly. "A devil. But you're here now, child. You are safe now." Life in the village was hard, but honest. Grace couldn't live off her grandmother's meager pension, so she started selling fruits by the roadside.
oranges, mangoes, plantains arranged in neat pyramids on a wooden table. The work was humble, nothing like the boutique, but it was hers. She woke with the sun, arranged her wares, and called out to passing cars and motorcycles. Fresh mangoes! Sweet oranges! Some people stared at her scars and looked away. Others showed her kindness. Slowly, day by day, Grace began to rebuild something inside herself that Patricia had tried to destroy. She learned to smile again, tentatively at first, then more genuinely. She discovered that freedom, even freedom accompanied by poverty, was sweeter than captivity in comfort. And then there was Daniel. He started appearing in the third week, a young man on a motorcycle who would stop to buy fruit, even though there were other vendors closer to his route. "Good morning," he'd say, his smile warm and easy. "I'll take 3 mangoes, please." At first, Grace thought nothing of it, just another customer. But he kept coming back, always choosing her stand, always lingering to chat. "How's business today? Is your grandmother well?" They talked about small things, the weather, the village gossip, her fruit selection. Daniel never mentioned her scars, never stared at them, just looked into her eyes when he spoke to her as if that was all he saw. One afternoon, after weeks of these brief encounters, Daniel didn't leave after buying his usual mangoes. Instead, he parked his motorcycle and sat on the bench near her stand. "Grace," he said, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something. I like you. I like talking to you. I like seeing you every day. I like your spirit, your strength, the way you handle yourself with such grace. No pun intended." He smiled, then grew serious again. "I know life has been hard for you. I can see it in your eyes, in your scars. But I want you to know that when I look at you, I see someone beautiful, inside and out. Would you consider letting me court you properly?" Grace's hand flew to her scarred cheek instinctively, old shame rising. "Daniel, I'm not what you think. I'm damaged. You are strong," he interrupted gently. "You are a survivor. And you are the woman I want to know better, if you let me." Grace looked at this man who had shown her nothing but kindness, who saw past her scars to something she thought was lost forever, and felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. It was hope. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'd like that." Daniel's smile could have lit up the entire village. A few weeks later, he invited her to his home to meet his family. Grace dressed in her best wrapper, nervous and excited. And when Daniel picked her up on his motorcycle, she held onto him as they rode through winding roads. When they finally arrived, Grace's jaw dropped. The house was massive, a sprawling compound with multiple buildings, expensive cars parked in the driveway, and beautifully manicured gardens. Daniel helped her off the motorcycle, laughing at her expression. "Surprise," he said sheepishly. "I should have mentioned, my family does well for ourselves." Grace couldn't believe it. This kind, humble man who had courted her at her fruit stand was rich, wealthy beyond anything she'd imagined, and he wanted her anyway. Grace and Daniel's courtship blossomed into something beautiful and real. He introduced her to his family, who welcomed her with open arms, scars and all. His mother hugged her and whispered, "My son has good taste. He sees what matters." 6 months later, they married in a simple but elegant ceremony, with Grandma Ruth weeping tears of joy in the front row. Grace couldn't believe this was her life now, waking up in a beautiful home, loved by a man who treated her like a queen, no longer wondering where her next meal would come from or who would hurt her next. Daniel's wealth meant she never had to worry about money again, but more importantly, his love meant she never had to doubt her worth. They were happy in a way Grace had never imagined possible. She'd survived hell and found heaven on the other side. 2 years into their marriage, Grace and Daniel were driving through town on a casual afternoon, discussing plans for the nursery. Grace was 3 months pregnant with their first child. As they passed through a busy market area, Grace spotted someone familiar by the roadside. A woman in a faded wrapper, her hair unkempt, sat behind a small display of mangoes and oranges, calling out weakly to passers-by.
"Daniel, stop the car," Grace said suddenly, her heart pounding. As they pulled over and Grace got out, she realized she hadn't been mistaken. It was Rose, her stepsister, looking thin and worn, nothing like the pampered girl who used to sit on the couch eating while Grace scrubbed floors. Rose looked up at the sound of footsteps and froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Grace," she whispered, as if seeing a ghost. What are you doing here?" Grace knelt beside her. "I could ask you the same thing. Rose, what happened? You married Marcus. You were supposed to be—" Rose's face crumpled and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Marcus wasn't who he said he was, Grace. He was a con man. He took everything, the dowry, mother's savings, money from the boutique. He cleaned us out and disappeared 6 months after the wedding. The boutique closed. We lost the house. Everything fell apart." Rose buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "And mother is sick. She's in the hospital. Cancer. We can't afford the treatment. Lily is working as a house help for another family just to survive. And I'm here, selling mangoes just like you used to. I'm so sorry, Grace, for everything we did to you, for how we treated you. You didn't deserve any of it."
Grace listened to Rose's story, feeling a complex tangle of emotions. Anger for the years of suffering, vindication that justice had somehow been served, but also an unexpected pang of compassion. These were the people who had made her life a living nightmare, who had stood by while Patricia tortured her. But looking at Rose now, broken and desperate, Grace realized that holding on to hate would only poison her own happiness. She thought of her father, who had loved her despite his blindness, and of Daniel, who had taught her what real love looked like. She took a deep breath. "Take me to the hospital," Grace said quietly. Rose's head snapped up. "What? I want to see your mother and Lily. Take me to them." At the hospital, Grace found Patricia in a public ward, thin and frail, her once proud gearing reduced to nothing. Lily sat beside the bed, her eyes red from crying. When they saw Grace walk in, both women stared in stunned silence. Patricia tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. "Grace, Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was jealous. I was cruel. I was everything terrible. I destroyed you for no reason except my own insecurity. Please, can you ever forgive me?" Grace stood there for a long moment, looking at the woman who had burnt her face, who had stolen her childhood, who had tried to break her spirit. Part of her wanted to turn and walk away, to let them suffer as she had suffered. But then she felt Daniel's hand on her shoulder, supportive, steady, and she remembered Grandma Ruth's words, "Bitterness is a poison you drink yourself." Grace took a deep breath. "I'll pay for the treatments," she said finally. "All of them. And I'll help Rose and Lily get back on their feet. Not because you deserve it, you don't, but because I deserve peace, and I won't get that by becoming like you." Patricia wept openly, and Rose and Lily clutched each other, overwhelmed with gratitude and shame. As Grace and Daniel left the hospital, she felt lighter than she had in years. She'd been through fire, literally, and had emerged stronger, kinder, more whole. She'd found love when she thought she was unlovable, found wealth when she had nothing, and most importantly, found herself. Grace squeezed Daniel's hand and smiled, feeling their baby flutter inside her. Her story hadn't ended in tragedy, it had ended in triumph. And that, she thought, was the greatest revenge of all. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just living, but loving. She had won.